retired soldier returns home after 4 years of service, only to find a naked man in his wife's bed. But not only did his wife not feel the least bit guilty, she turned around and took out the divorce papers she had prepared. But Paul was neither bitter nor angry. Instead, he smiled a very strange smile. It turns out that just a short time ago, Paul had met a woman on the train. Victoria accidentally bumped into him while carrying luggage. Then the train went into a violent jolt. They fell to the ground with inertia and hugged each other. Victoria picks up the ticket and returns it to him, but then she suddenly began to vomit, and vomited all over Paul's uniform. God-ordained destiny can't be stopped. Paul had just boarded the bus, but Victoria happened to be on the bus. Two punks noticed that Victoria was pretty. They immediately sat her down next to her and started flirting with her. Victoria didn't want to talk to them, but their behavior became more and more aggressive. Paul couldn't stand it and yelled at them. The punks felt that their authority was being offended. They immediately attacked Paul. Unfortunately, they were beaten by Paul and could not move. Finally, all 3 of them were kicked out by the driver. Victoria looked at him from the back window. She felt very sorry for Paul. Paul had no choice but to continue his journey on foot. But as he walked, he found Victoria sitting in front of the road silently crying. They ran into each other 3 times in one day. This had to be a reintroduction. They greeted each other by name and shook hands. Paul asked Victoria why she got off here, but Victoria couldn't stop crying. She had arrived at the station but was afraid to enter her home because she was pregnant with her college professor's child without marriage. But now the professor had abandoned her. Her conservative father would kill her. The kind-hearted Paul suddenly thought of a good idea. He could pretend to be Victoria's husband and stay at her house for one night, and then leave a letter without saying goodbye. This would create the illusion that Victoria had been abandoned by her husband. As unrealistic as this sounds, but they really did go home like that. To make it look real, Paul also took the paper ring from the chocolate and put it on Victoria's finger. When they got home, Alberto's father was really angry. He had to call off their marriage. He was very hostile to Paul. After all, Victoria was his only daughter. Alberto can't accept that a strange man has suddenly taken his daughter away from him. Luckily, his grandfather Pedro is very open-minded. He liked the chocolates Paul was selling. Alberto had no choice but to leave. During the evening meal, they learned that Paul is not only an orphan, but also an ordinary chocolate salesman. Alberto seizes the opportunity to suppress Paul again. Despite Victoria's efforts to defend him, it still put a lot of pressure on Paul. But the night was the hardest part. Mother Maria decorated their wedding room with great pomp and circumstance and made tonight their wedding night because she believed that with a good start, marriage will always be happy. Paul kept his promise to his wife. He volunteered to take the blanket and sleep on the floor. But then there was a sudden knock at the door. It turns out to be Alberto checking in. Paul rushed from the floor and got under Victoria's blanket. They pretend to hug each other in bed. Victoria's father comes in to say goodnight to them. Alberto left. They looked deeply into each other's eyes and were restraining their repressed desire. But Paul, the sensible one, finally managed to control his desire. The next day Paul said goodbye to Victoria and packed his things to leave. But Pedro, who was up early, found him again. Pedro took Paul into the woods and showed him an old vine. It was the vine that made this place into a large vineyard. This vine is the root of their life, and now it's the root of Paul's life, because they have made Paul their family. Paul, fatherless and motherless, was deeply moved, so he decided to stay one more day. It was the day of their big grape harvest. It was also the most important day of the year for Victoria's family. The whole family rushed to the vineyard. They began to gather the ripe grapes with excitement. Paul also went in to help them. Alberto, who had always been hostile to Paul, felt the urge to compete with him again. As the two of them hurriedly picked the grapes while spying on each other's progress, they kept competing to pick grapes and speed each other up. The other members laughed out loud at the competition. In the end, Alberto won the race, but they both became the heroes of the vineyard. After picking, they dumped all the grapes into a huge wooden barrel. People climbed back into the barrel. They started to stomp the grapes into the grape juice with their feet, but it had to be all girls who stomped in the barrel. Victoria soon joined in. The women danced on the grapes. The men were outside playing the piano and applauding. The atmosphere was very happy and beautiful. Paul was pulled into the barrel with everyone surrounding him. Everyone kept circling around them. They brought the two of them to the point of ambiguity. When they came out, they finally couldn't stop kissing each other deeply. But Paul soon pushed Victoria away. He knew he was deeply in love with her. Unfortunately, Paul is not a free man now. Because he was already married, Paul could never betray his wife at home. Paul was in a very painful ordeal. He suddenly didn't know what to do. But Alberto didn't like him as usual. Alberto even got into a heated argument with him. Paul felt that there was no point in staying any longer, so he packed up his things and decided to leave immediately. But Pedro stopped him again. Pedro opened his wine cellar and offered Paul a variety of vintage wines. Paul could hardly refuse. He accidentally drank too much wine. In the evening, Pedro dragged him to Victoria's window again and asked Paul to sing to the window with all his heart. This is a very traditional way of courting in the vineyard. If the light is on, it means that the woman wants to be with the man for life. But Victoria was now very conflicted because she knew Paul would leave sooner or later. Paul had sobered up by now. He didn't want to make any more mistakes, so he took his bags and left the place for the night. After Paul had gone some distance, he couldn't help but look back. At that moment, Victoria finally turned on the lights, but the painful Paul still sensible choice to leave. The next day, Paul was waiting for the bus to leave, but then Victoria arrived in town too. It turned out to be a toasting day, so the whole family came here. Victoria finds Paul. She thanked him for the serenade he sang last night. At the same time, she was ready to say goodbye to him for the last time. That's when Alberto suddenly came over. He thinks of Paul as his real son-in-law. It turns out that Paul's serenade last night not only touched Victoria, Alberto also saw Paul's true feelings for his daughter. Alberto immediately made a solemn announcement to everyone. Tonight they would have the biggest wedding ever. The crowd cheered, but the two of them were desperate. Victoria decides to tell Alberto the truth. Paul gave Victoria a medal as a gift after the birth of her baby. Victoria thought Paul was the most honorable man she had ever met. Then Victoria tells Alberto the truth. Alberto was shocked to hear it. He immediately left in anger. Although the truth is very cruel, but confession is the best option now. Paul missed the bus and set out on foot for his journey home. Luckily, he met a kind-hearted driver halfway. He agreed to give Paul a ride. The driver asked Paul what he was doing in the neighborhood. Paul said he was walking in the clouds. The driver then welcomed him back to the ground. Paul returned home with a lonely and despondent body, but he found a naked man in his wife's room. His wife didn't make much of an excuse to cover it up. She says outright that their marriage was a mistake. She didn't want to go on living like this. She then took out the divorce papers she had prepared. But Paul didn't make a fuss, and he was calm and unusual. The wife thought Paul had suffered a terrible shock. Paul even ran away in excitement. He quickly got into the car to return to the vineyard. Afraid, Paul approached Alberto, Victoria's father. Paul apologized to him very sincerely and solemnly proposed to Victoria. But Alberto, who was angry, didn't listen to him. He also began to attack Paul madly, but Alberto slipped and fell down. He also threw the kerosene lamp into the vineyard. The fire spread immediately with the wind. Several vines quickly burst into flames. Paul took off his coat and tried to put out the fire, but the fire grew bigger and bigger. The whole vineyard was in flames. At that moment, Victoria's brother got caught in the fire again. Paul immediately ran over to him and put out the flames with his clothes. Paul then quickly helped him out of the fire. The fire was irreversible. All the vines were burned to ashes. Alberto's heart felt like it was being cut by a knife. Without the vines, they had lost the root of their lives. Until the next morning, the fire was finally extinguished. Looking at the remains of the fire, the family's hopes fell from the clouds to the sea. They were in a state of unparalleled grief. Alberto was so sad that he cried. Then Paul suddenly thought of something. He went to the place where Pedro had shown him the vine. Although the vine had been burned to a trunk, but he pulled the vine up by the roots with great force and desperation. Paul then took the vine to Alberto and asked him to check if it was burned. Alberto took out a knife and cut the bark. The vine was still fresh inside. This meant that the roots were still alive, so they were able to grow a new vineyard again. Everyone breathed a long sigh of relief. The family's hope was rekindled. Alberto, who had always been hostile to Paul, accepted him from the bottom of his heart. Paul took out a ring made of chocolate paper and put it on Victoria's finger again, and the two of them finally got married with the blessing of the people. God has given us the greatest gift than to let me meet you, and while I was in love with you, and you love me too,